The rain pounded the pavement, each drop a tiny fist against Elijah's skin as he stood frozen on the curb. His backpack, stuffed with everything he owned, sagged against his shoulder, the weight of his father's words heavier still, "You're no son of mine." At 18, on the day he was supposed to celebrate freedom, Elijah was cast out of the only home he'd ever known for loving who he did. The small town of Willow Creek, Virginia, wasn't kind to boys like him. Nestled in the rolling hills, it was a place where picket fences hid secrets and church bells drowned out cries for change. Elijah's father, Pastor John Whitaker, was the town's moral compass, his sermons thundering with warnings of sin. When Elijah came out, whispering his truth in a moment of desperate courage, John's face had twisted, not with anger, but with something colder disgust. By nightfall, Elijah was on the street, the door of the old Victorian house on Maple Street slamming shut behind him. He didn't cry. Not then. Instead, he walked, the rain soaking his worn leather jacket, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon glow of the diner ahead. Sally's place was a beacon in the storm, its flickering sign promising warmth. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried onions, and the jukebox played a soft country tune. Elijah slid into a booth, his hands trembling as he counted the few dollars in his pocket, enough for a coffee, maybe a burger. He was alone, but not for long. Rough night. The voice was gentle, laced with a southern drawl that felt like a warm blanket. Elijah looked up to see a guy about his age, maybe a year older, with warm brown eyes and paint-splattered jeans. His name tag read Caleb. He carried a notepad, but his gaze held something deeper: curiosity, maybe empathy. "You could say that," Elijah muttered, his voice hoarse from shouting into the void of his father's rejection. He didn't want pity, but Caleb's eyes didn't offer it. Instead, they held a quiet understanding, like he'd seen storms like this before. Caleb slid into the booth across from him, ignoring the empty diner. "Name's Caleb Monroe. I've seen you around Pastor Whitaker's kid, right?" Elijah flinched at the title, but Caleb didn't push. "Listen, you look like you need more than coffee. My shift's almost over. Want to talk?" Elijah didn't know why he said yes. Maybe it was the rain, the hunger, or the way Caleb's smile felt like the first kind thing he'd seen all day. They talked until the diner closed, Caleb sharing stories of his own, how he'd left home at 16, how he painted to make sense of a world that didn't always make sense. He was an artist, working odd jobs to save for a studio, his dreams as vivid as the colors he splashed on canvas. By the time they stepped back into the rain, Elijah felt something shift, a spark of hope, fragile but real. Caleb offered him a couch for the night, a small apartment above the hardware store where the walls were covered in half-finished paintings. As Elijah lay there, listening to the rain and Caleb's soft breathing from the next room, he made a vow. He'd survive this. He'd prove them wrong: his father, the town, everyone who thought he was broken. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to call somewhere home again. The next morning, Caleb handed him a coffee and a plan. "There's a community center in Richmond, about an hour's drive. They help kids like us, kicked out, lost, whatever. I know the guy who runs it, Marcus. He's good people." Elijah hesitated. Leaving Willow Creek meant leaving everything he'd known, but staying meant suffocating. He nodded, and by noon, they were in Caleb's beat-up pickup, the radio crackling with old rock songs as they headed toward something new. Richmond was a shock to Elijah's system, bustling, loud, alive. The community center was a converted warehouse, its walls plastered with flyers for pride events and support groups. Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with a warm laugh, welcomed Elijah like family. "You're not alone," he said, handing Elijah a pamphlet about housing programs. "And you're stronger than you know." For the first time in days, Elijah believed it. Caleb stayed by his side, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. They spent weeks together, Elijah crashing at Caleb's place when the center's dorms felt too crowded. Caleb taught him to paint, his hands guiding Elijah's over the canvas, their laughter filling the small apartment. It was messy, imperfect, and beautiful. Elijah felt himself falling not just for Caleb, but for the person he was becoming. Someone brave. Someone whole. But Willow Creek wasn't done with him. One night, Marcus got a call from a lawyer in town. The Victorian house on Maple Street, the one Elijah had called home, wasn't what it seemed. His father had never owned it. The deed belonged to Elijah's late mother, who'd left it to him in a will John had hidden. The revelation hit like a lightning bolt. The house, the symbol of his rejection, was his by right. And Elijah knew he had to go back not for revenge, but for justice. The drive back to Willow Creek was quiet. The hum of Caleb's truck, the only sound breaking the tension. Elijah stared out the window, the rolling hills blurring into memories of his childhood running through the backyard. His mother's laughter, the way she'd sing him to sleep before cancer took her when he was 10. The house on Maple Street was her legacy, not his father's, and the thought of reclaiming it felt like reclaiming her love. Caleb glanced over, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift. "You sure about this, Eli? Facing him won't be easy." His voice was soft, but there was a strength in it, a reminder that Elijah wasn't alone. "I have to," Elijah said, his jaw tight. "He doesn't get to take everything from me." Caleb nodded, his eyes returning to the road, but his hand brushed Elijah's, a silent promise. Willow Creek hadn't changed in the months since Elijah left. The same faded storefronts lined Main Street. The same church steeple loomed over the town square. But Elijah had changed. He wasn't the scared kid who'd been thrown out. He was someone who'd found a spark of purpose, fueled by Caleb's quiet faith and Marcus's mentorship. Still, as they pulled up to the Victorian house, its sagging porch and peeling paint a ghost of his past, his heart pounded. The lawyer, Ms. Evelyn Carter, met them at the diner. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Over coffee, she laid out the truth. Elijah's mother, Sarah, had inherited the house from her grandmother. When she died, the will named Elijah as the sole heir, but John had buried the documents, claiming the house as his own. "Your father's been living there rent-free, preaching from a pulpit built on lies," Evelyn said, sliding a folder across the table. "You've got every right to claim it." Elijah's hands shook as he opened the folder, seeing his mother's handwriting for the first time in years. A letter, tucked among the legal papers, read, "To my Eli, this house is your sanctuary. Never let anyone take your light." Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them back. This wasn't just about a house, it was about his mother's love, his identity, his right to exist. Caleb squeezed his shoulder. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady. Elijah took a deep breath. "I'm going to confront him. And I'm taking the house back." The next morning, they stood on the porch, the air thick with the scent of rain and old wood. Elijah knocked, his heart a drumbeat in his chest. The door creaked open, and there was John Whitaker, his face a mask of righteous fury. "What do you want?" He spat, his eyes flicking to Caleb with disdain. "I want what's mine," Elijah said, holding up the will. "This house. Mom left it to me." John's face paled, but his voice was venomous. "You're no son of mine. And this is God's house now. It was never yours. Elijah shot back, his voice steady despite the storm inside. And I'm not here to beg. I'm here to take it. Caleb stood beside him, silent but unwavering, his presence a shield. John laughed, a cold, bitter sound. You think you can just walk back into this town? They'll tear you apart. But Elijah wasn't the same boy who'd left. He'd faced rejection, found love, and built a life. He wasn't afraid anymore. Evelyn arrived with a sheriff's deputy, a no-nonsense woman named Deputy Ruiz. Pastor Whitaker, she said, her voice firm. You've got no legal claim here. Elijah's the rightful owner. John's face twisted, but he stepped aside, his silence louder than any sermon. Inside, the house felt like a time capsule, Elijah's old room untouched, his mother's paintings still on the walls. But it wasn't home anymore. Not yet. As John packed his things, Elijah wandered to the backyard, where he and his mother used to plant flowers. Caleb followed, his hand finding Elijah's. You did it, he whispered. Not yet, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm going to make this place a home again. For us. Caleb's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. And in that moment, Elijah knew he wasn't just reclaiming a house, was reclaiming his life. The house creaked under Elijah's footsteps, each groan of the floorboards a reminder of the life he'd lost and the one he was building. The first night back was strange. Sleeping in his old room with Caleb on a mattress on the floor, the walls echoing with memories of his mother's voice and his father's sermons. But morning brought clarity. This was his chance to rewrite the story of Maple Street. Willow Creek buzzed with gossip. By noon, neighbors were whispering about the pastor's fall, their eyes darting to Elijah and Caleb as they hauled paint cans and cleaning supplies into the house. Some offered tight-lipped smiles. Others crossed the street to avoid them. Elijah didn't care. He had Caleb, whose laughter filled the empty rooms as they scrubbed years of neglect from the walls. We're going to need more than paint to fix this place, Caleb said, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the cracked plaster. But it's got good bones. He grinned, and Elijah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. They worked side by side, tearing down old wallpaper, sanding floors, their hands brushing as they passed tools. Every touch was a reminder that they were building something together, not just a house, but a future. But the town wasn't ready to let them be. One evening, as they sat on the porch sharing a pizza, a rock sailed through the air, shattering a window. Elijah jumped to his feet, heart racing, as a group of teens scattered into the dusk. Caleb's hand found his, grounding him. They're just scared, he said softly. Scared of change. Elijah wasn't so sure. The next day, graffiti marred the front door, "Fags go home." The word stung, but Elijah refused to let them win. He and Caleb painted over it, turning the door into a mural of bright colors, blues and yellows, like the sky after a storm. This is our home, Elijah said, his voice fierce. Caleb nodded, adding a swirl of green to the design, his eyes shining with pride. Marcus drove up from Richmond to help, bringing supplies and stories of his own fight for acceptance. You're not just reclaiming a house, he told Elijah. You're showing this town what courage looks like. His words stuck with Elijah, fueling him through the long days of repairs and the longer nights of doubt. As the house took shape, so did their lives. Caleb set up a small studio in the attic, his paintings filling the space with color and life. Elijah found a job at a local bookstore, where the owner, Ms. Harper, didn't care who he loved as long as he shelved books with care. Slowly, They carved out a place in Willow Creek, not as outcasts, but as pioneers of something new. But John Whitaker wasn't gone. Rumors swirled that he was rallying his congregation, calling Elijah's return a sinful takeover. One Sunday, as Elijah and Caleb worked in the yard, a group from the church marched down Maple Street, holding signs that read God's house, not yours. Elijah's stomach twisted, but he faced them, Caleb at his side. "This is my mother's house," Elijah said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "And I'm making it a home for everyone who's been told they don't belong." The crowd faltered, some lowering their signs, others turning away. Caleb squeezed his hand, and Elijah felt a surge of strength. They weren't just fighting for a house, they were fighting for a world where love didn't have to hide. By the end of the month, the house was transformed. The porch was sturdy, the walls bright with fresh paint, and the garden bloomed with flowers Elijah had planted in his mother's memory. But the real change was in Elijah. He wasn't just surviving anymore, was thriving, with Caleb's love as his anchor. The house on Maple Street was no longer just a house site, was a statement. Elijah and Caleb had turned it into a sanctuary, its doors open to anyone who needed a place to feel safe. They hosted a small gathering for the community center kids from Richmond, filling the backyard with laughter, music, and fairy lights strung through the trees. For the first time, Elijah felt like he belonged not just in the house, but in the world. But peace was fragile. One night, as they slept, a Molotov cocktail shattered the living room window, flames licking at the curtains. Elijah woke to Caleb's shout, the smell of smoke choking the air. They grabbed extinguishers, dousing the fire before it could spread, but the damage was done. The living room was charred, the walls scarred with hate. Deputy Ruiz was there by morning, her face grim as she surveyed the wreckage. "We'll find who did this," she promised. But Elijah knew the truth. Hate didn't always have a face. Still, he and Caleb refused to be broken. They cleaned up, repainted, and hung new curtains, their hands steady despite the fear. The attack drew attention. A local reporter, Jamie Torres, wrote a story about Elijah's fight to reclaim the house and the hate he faced. The article went viral, shared across social media, bringing support from unexpected places. Letters arrived from strangers, some offering money, others sharing their own stories of rejection and resilience. A queer youth group from D.C. drove down to help repair the damage, turning the cleanup into a celebration of defiance. Caleb's paintings became part of the story, too. His latest piece, a vibrant mural of two hands clasped against a rainbow sky, was featured in the article. Galleries in Richmond and beyond took notice, and soon Caleb was getting calls for commissions. "This is because of you," he told Elijah, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a reason to keep painting." Elijah shook his head. "We did this together." And they had. Every step, every fight, every laugh, every quiet moment had been a partnership. Their love wasn't just a feeling. It was a force, reshaping the house and the town around them. But John Whitaker wasn't finished. He filed a lawsuit, claiming Elijah had forged the will. The legal battle was a gut punch, draining their savings and testing their resolve. Evelyn fought fiercely, uncovering more of John's lies, how he'd manipulated church funds, how he'd hidden Sarah's will to keep control. The courtroom became a battleground, with Elijah testifying about his mother's love and his right to her legacy. The town watched, divided. Some rallied behind John, clinging to tradition. Others, like M.S. Harper and a few church members who'd grown tired of his hypocrisy, stood with Elijah. The trial was grueling, but Caleb was there every day, sketching in the gallery, his presence a reminder that Elijah wasn't alone. When the judge ruled in Elijah's favor, declaring the house unequivocally his, the courtroom erupted. John's face crumpled, his power broken. Elijah felt no joy in his father's defeat, only a quiet relief. He'd won, not just the house, but the right to be himself. That night, as they sat on the porch, Caleb pulled Elijah close. "We're building something bigger than us," he said, his voice soft against the hum of crickets. Elijah nodded, his heart full. The house wasn't just theirs, Anna Maria, it was a beacon for anyone who'd been told they didn't belong. A year later, the house on Maple Street was unrecognizable. The Victorian glowed with fresh paint, its garden bursting with color, its doors open to a community that was slowly learning to heal. Elijah and Caleb had turned it into a safe house for queer youth, a place where kids like them could find refuge, support, and love. They called it Sarah's Sanctuary, after Elijah's mother, her spirit woven into every corner. The grand opening was a celebration unlike Willow Creek had ever seen. Marcus brought a busload of kids from Richmond, their laughter mingling with the music from a local band. Ms. Harper donated books. Jamie Torres covered the event, and even Deputy Ruiz stopped by, her uniform swapped for jeans and a smile. The backyard was alive with fairy lights, tables groaning with food, and stories of hope shared under the stars. Elijah stood on the porch, watching the crowd, his heart swelling. Caleb slipped an arm around his waist, his paint-splattered hands now a familiar comfort. "Look at this," Caleb said, his voice awed. "We did this." Elijah leaned into him, feeling the weight of their journey, the pain, the fight, the love that had carried them through. But the moment wasn't without shadows. John Whitaker had left town, his congregation fractured, but his absence left questions. Some in Willow Creek still whispered, still judged. Yet others had changed. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street now waved, even brought casseroles. Change was slow, but it was real. One evening, as Elijah sorted through his mother's old things, he found a photo of her holding him as a baby, her smile radiant. Tucked behind it was a note, "Be brave, my Eli. Love always wins." He showed it to Caleb, tears in his eyes, and they framed it, hanging it in the living room beside Caleb's mural. It was a reminder of why they'd fought, not just for a house, but for a world where no one would be kicked out for being themselves. The sanctuary grew, drawing kids from across Virginia, even beyond. Elijah and Caleb became mentors, their love a testament to resilience. They faced challenges, funding struggles, occasional vandalism, but they faced them together, their bond unbreakable. Caleb's art flourished, his paintings telling stories of hope and defiance, while Elijah found his voice, speaking at community events about acceptance and healing. One night, as they lay in bed, the house quiet around them, Elijah traced the lines of Caleb's face. "I was so lost when I met you," he whispered. "You gave me a home." Caleb smiled, pulling him close. "We gave each other a home." And in that moment, under the roof of Sarah's sanctuary, Elijah knew they'd done more than reclaim a house. They'd built a legacy, one of love, courage, and a promise that no one would be left out in the rain again.